Hey guys, it's Shaggles here, and just like I promised in the last video, today I'll be doing a breakdown of the abilities and how they work in my newest game, As the Day Turns. So right here you can actually see me drawing a little doodle guy that for the sake of these examples we're going to be calling Guts. In these beginning stages of the abilities, I wanted to roughly draw out the ideas I had for how some of the abilities would actually work. So this first drawing of Guts you see, he's blasting like a crazy looking particle effect out of his arm, showing off my idea for an arm cannon. Next you can see that Guts is attaching his grappling hook to his massive sword and then throwing the sword with the sword being pulled back to him. And the last drawing I did of Guts was with his crossbow. So after I had some rough ideas and drawings for my new abilities, I had to program them. Starting with the arm cannon because I thought it would be the easiest. Fortunately for me, it ended up actually being the easiest. Before I could actually get into making the arm cannon ability though, I had to do some prep work to make adding other abilities easier later on. This prep work involved me adding a string variable called prosthetic equipped. Next, I made it so that when the player presses the shift key, it checks to see what the prosthetic equipped variable is set to. The reason I did this was so that later on when I made an inventory system, the player can select the ability they want to equip, which will change this variable to that ability name, and then it will run the code for the correct ability when the player hits the shift key. Next, I duplicated the double jump particle effect that I had already made, because it would be a little bit faster than making one from scratch, and messed around with some of the values until I got a blasty particle effect for the arm cannon. Fun fact, particle effects are kind of like Griffith from Berserk. They look really cool and really beautiful, but they're fake as fuck. What I mean is that particle effects don't have any collisions on them at all, at least not in the Construct 3 engine, and I believe most others also don't do that. My best guess for why this is the case is that it would probably be incredibly performance heavy. Now, because of this, I had to make a collision box for the arm cannon so that I could actually test if it hits an opponent. It took me a bit of trial and error, but I eventually got it to be the right size for how the particle effects look when they shoot out. Once I had finished preparing the arm cannon, I was able to start actually coding the ability in. I started by making it so that the player's prosthetic arm would spawn both the cannon particles and collider at the same time from a specific image point on the arm sprite. Because I wanted the player to be able to aim where they shoot the cannon blast, I made it so that both the particle effect and the collider set their angles to the player's mouse position right after they spawn in. Right here you can actually see me testing this initial part out, which currently looks like shit, but I'll get to that later. Next, I adjusted the width of the hitbox object to only be a few pixels and added a tween behavior to it. This behavior will let me make the collider object slowly extend its width at the same time that the particle effects extend outwards from the player's arm, which of course is what I did next. Then I also made it so that after the particle effect's lifetime is over, effectively destroying the particles, the hitbox also gets destroyed automatically. Next, I made a small quick test to make sure that if the cannon hitbox hit something, it could run code correctly, and the way I tested this was checking to see if the stump would get destroyed. Now that I knew the hitbox worked correctly, I made it so it would be invisible, so the player would only see the particle effects, which this video is sped up 3 times, so it still looks really shitty, but it was looking good enough for me in live action. Now I needed to make it look like the particle blast is coming out of the player's arm, so I made a special animation for the arm, which took a lot of tweaking as well. After making the simple animation for using the cannon, I made it so the arm would also get angled towards wherever the player's mouse is when blasting the cannon, and then I had to reset the angle after the blast is over. Now this was looking great, except when the player shot behind themselves, the arm wasn't visible anymore, so I made the arm always get drawn on top of all the other objects while it was playing this animation, which still looked bad, so I made the arm mirror itself if the player aimed behind the player, hoping that it would cure the ugly upside down arm. It didn't at all. Long story short, eventually after tweaking the specifics around the angling of the arm, I made it so that the player would just mirror to whatever side that the mouse is of them whenever they try to use the ability. Now I ran into a new issue. Whenever anybody tried to use an ability, because the arm animation had an upward angle, it looked a little anti-Semitic. So I made the arm straight instead of having that upward angle. And here you can see me realize that the arm was still going too much up, so I made the arm go down instead. After getting rid of the Nazi salute bug, I was finally ready to move on to the next ability, the crossbow. I wanted to make the grapple sword, but I knew it would be really hard to actually code, so I left it for last. The first thing I did was design a crossbow bolt sprite object that would spawn out of the player's arm when they had this ability equipped. It looked kind of like a dick, but I didn't notice that yet. Next, I copy-pasted my code for the cannon blast and changed around a few values here and there. Now instead of spawning the particles and whatnot, it just spawns a crossbow bolt and sets its angle towards the mouse. I ended up using the same arm animation for all of the abilities I've made so far, just because there wasn't really a reason to make any new ones. I then also added a pin behavior to the crossbow bolt, as I wanted it to stick into objects that it hits. because that looks cool. So I wrote some code to make sure that the bolt now pins itself to whatever object it hits. Then I finally noticed that the crossbow bolt was looking a little phallic, so I made it longer and neutered it. I also changed the layer that the bolts would be drawn on so they wouldn't stick out like such a sword deck. Something else I noticed that could get both annoying and performance heavy was that after shooting the bolts, they would stay in the ground forever, so I made them fade out shortly after colliding with an object, making the screen less cluttered and your computer have less objects to render. Now that the crossbow is good enough, I noticed that there was an odd bug in the corner of the player's screen called bad art. This was originally the way I wanted the player to know how high their frenzy meter was, but it didn't really fit the rest of the game's vibe all that much, so I just removed it and I got started on making a better UI. What I ended up with was an empty slot where the face used to be that would show the player which prosthetic tool they had equipped, and then next to this orb I made 3 smaller orbs that would tell the player how frenzied they are. If there's 1 orb filled, not very frenzied, 2, a little bit more frenzied, 3, all the way frenzied. Now that I had a better fitting UI as well as the arm cannon and crossbow done, it was time to make arguably the coolest ability design yet, the grapple sword. And I'd like to give a shout out to my coworker. He's the one who actually came up with the idea for this. He thought it would be really cool, and I agree, it's pretty cool, and you'll see it if you stick around to the end of the video. First, I started this by doing the same thing I always do, copy and pasting my previous code. Instead of spawning a new object for this ability, the idea is that the player would be taking the greatsword off their back and throwing it wherever the player aims it at. So I made a new special throw animation for the sword, and I made it so that when the player presses the ability button, the sword would be set to this animation, angled towards the mouse, and then use Construct 3's bullet behavior to move towards the mouse for a set amount of time. After that time was up, the sword was supposed to tween its position back to the player's hand. The only issue with this is that I copy and pasted code without actually changing the object that I copied from to the greatsword, resulting in about 10 to 20 minutes of completely wasted time trying to figure out what was wrong. Turns out I was wrong. Eventually I got that whole angle and movement thing figured out. Now the only issue is that it looked wicked janky. But taking my own advice, I would soon be covering the ugly with more ugly. More specifically, I made a new rope object which will work similar to how the grappling hook ability works. Or basically, it'll be attached to the player's hand on one end and the sword on the other end. Then to make sure the rope worked right, I set its width to the distance between both the sword and the hand. This also looked janky at first, so I made the rope constantly set its position to the player's hand. This way, even if the player is moving in any direction, it looks like the player is pulling the sword back. Now that I had all the visual and programming junk out of the way, it was time to start doing the sound design, which not only am I bad at that, but is probably the only part of game dev I actually don't enjoy, like at all. My strategy for this game is to find free audio clips that fit the general sound I'm looking for on Pixabay, specifically free for commercial use ones, and then I pull those clips over into Soundtrap, which is a free browser-based DAW to edit the audio to fit my means for it in this game. Once I get the sound I'm looking for, I export it and then import it into Construct 3. Here's a little game dev secret that I actually learned from a YouTuber called Inbound Shovel. He's working on a game called Isadora's Edge right now. Instead of getting multiple audio clips for every sound in your game, you get one, and then when it plays in the game, you can set the pitch to be slightly random from whatever its normal pitch is. Unfortunately for me, Construct 3 doesn't have the ability to do that, but fortunately enough for me, there's something else that works similarly enough called playback speed. Setting the playback speed for each audio clip to a random value does change the pitch of the audio clip, but it also changes the speed that the sound plays at, so I'm gonna have to be a little bit more careful of how far I let that random value go for my game's audio. This last clip of me testing out the grappling hook that you're seeing is pretty much the last thing I got before my recording software killed itself, but I hope you guys enjoyed this deep dive into the abilities of my game, and if you'd like to see more in-depth content like this, just let me know in the comments below. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. Thank you.